Hello, my name is Jason Reichl, and you're listening to Risk Management Brick by Brick. Every episode, I sit down to talk risk, how to avoid it, how to manage it, and how it impacts our built world. This season, we'll be diving deep into the world of AI and talking its transformative influence on risk management. Over the next 8 episodes, I'll be interviewing a series of experts in the field who will be offering unique insights and perspectives on how AI is revolutionizing the way we approach and mitigate risk. Let's get to it. Hello, Ed. Welcome to Brick by Brick. I'm so excited to have you to talk about the world of healthcare, cybersecurity, what's happening there. I actually started my career in healthcare, so I'm always interested in what's going on there and what's new. Why don't we give a little introduction, Ed? Why don't you tell us about yourself and your company?
Yeah, Jason, thanks for inviting me on. Pleasure to be here. My name is Ed Gaudet. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Censinet. And we are focused on risk management, including enterprise and third-party risk and governance, risk, and compliance of cyber for health systems.
So let's talk about that. What did that mean? What are you guys doing on a day-to-day for your customers?
Yeah, so at a very high level, we help the security teams, the CISO, the business security teams really understand their risk posture as it relates to their ecosystem of third-party suppliers, vendors, and their products, and the risks that they're taking on when they contract with a supplier and a product. And we also help that same team look at their risk as it relates to their internal controls and processes and people and tools.
Amazing. Great. We're going to kind of dive into how technology is shaping and changing the landscape for your customers. But before we do that, why don't we just give people a little bit about your background so they can understand the journey for you?
Yeah. So I came out of school right into software. My first company was a startup. So got the startup bug. I guess you'd call me a serial entrepreneur. I've been at 11 companies. And I typically love to solve problems for industries that are looking to automate a particular process or set of processes using software. And I've done everything from development tools to middleware to obviously third-party and enterprise risk, data security, and all things in between. So typically infrastructure enterprise level software.
Amazing. And so when we take this, how this problem space and why this problem space, why are you here right now solving this problem?
Yeah. So I was basically retiring. I spent about a year causing trouble for my wife and my family by following around these guys again, like I was 18 again. And so cordially commanded to go back to work. And I came back to this issue that I faced at the last organization I was at around third-party risk. Being a supplier to health systems, we had to go through a security risk assessment. I used to say, if you see one, they're all different formats, different questions, different semantics within the questions themselves. And I thought there could be an opportunity to really normalize and create a consistent standard, if you will, for not only the elements within a security risk assessment, but also the process. And began to work with health systems from a design perspective, really got their requirements, worked with vendors, and I created a network, if you will, a two-sided network initially, where I connected the providers with their third-party vendors and their products. And that took off, and we began to add other areas of risk under that platform to include things like risk associated with research studies that include maybe a academic medical center and patient records and a pharmaceutical company to do maybe some cancer drug exploration or research.
One of my very earliest jobs was electronic medical records, and I would go from city to city into hospitals, spend a month there, helping them digitize all of their stuff and move into EMR and all of that. So I'm pretty aware of sort of those types of environments. But let's say that was like 1999. What's happened since 1999 in the world of healthcare that really puts risk at the forefront of what people should be investigating? And sort of, let's start to paint that picture of the next year, because I don't even want to go further than that, right? So what are you guys focused on? What's the evolution of the company look like and the needs of the customers?
Yeah, and just to catch people up contextually, back then in 99, up until 2010, healthcare was always behind every other industry as it relates to technology adoption. I used to say they were 5 years behind everybody. And so I typically really never worked with them. 2010 comes around, 2009, 2010. The Obama administration releases the high tech and the Reinvestment and Recoverabilities Act, High Tech and ARA, that puts a bunch of money out there for health systems to basically do a forklift upgrade of their infrastructure so they can get on electronic medical records, right? So back in 99, those were sort of the early days, the first wave, if you will. The real rush came in 2010 to 2015, where folks were out there trying to deploy those medical records so they could prove meaningful use and then take advantage of the money that was out there, subsidies that were out there to adopt that type of technology. That moved everyone onto electronic medical records, really transformed healthcare from paper to digital. And once you do that, your attack surface normally all of a sudden is exponential. You move from a paper-based attack surface to now an electronic attack surface where everything's connected. And you fast forward that to today, where now AI has been added to that attack surface. And again, that is geometric now in terms of the impact AI is going to have on the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the subsequent attacks that we're going to see over the next couple of years. Ransomware is fairly new. I mean, if you look at it, the first ransomware attack really was sort of in the 2015, 2016 timeframe. So we're not even scratching the surface yet in terms of the threats available through AI.
Yeah. So when we talk about that for healthcare and why I wanted to have you on the show is we have risk managers across the industry dealing with more types of risks than they've ever dealt, more high-tech risks. But, the information of people's personal records falling into the hands of someone else is a significant risk, right? So maybe we can walk through what transparency and accountability you're bringing to the space. How are you directing customers to really look at these problems? And what kind of frameworks are you deploying to solve it, both with technology? It probably is both technology enabled and people enabled within the internal culture of the organizations.
Yeah, the first thing is to take a process that was largely manual in and of itself, this notion of security risk assessments, and digitize it and do it in a way that really created leverage across the community. So the interesting thing about healthcare is it's a pretty big ecosystem in and of itself, but it's sort of a defined ecosystem. And this notion that one hospital has to assess the same vendor that's being used by the next hospital and then by the next hospital, it just seemed foolish to me. So by putting it on a network, you really get leverage. You get leverage of efficiencies. You take a time that on average, when we started was 44 days, basically down to a week or less of getting the vendor to respond. They're already in the system. Think of it as they have a cybersecurity data room, if you will, or a trust center. With that trust center, that can be shared with the next set of providers that come in. So they go from, again, that 5 days, 44 or 5, down to a click of a button. And that ability to share in a controlled way that risk data is really important. We're not just putting the risk data out there for any provider to see. There has to be a relationship or a transactional relationship that's facilitated across the network. That's really important. Because again, as a vendor, you don't want that information just going to anyone. You want to know who's going to, why they're using it. And you want to make sure that you're going to they're doing it for the right reasons. They're doing it because they want to have a relationship with you.
Right. And the exposure probably matures as the relationship matures.
Yeah, that's right.
So I was a head of product at TradeShift, which is a procurement software, and worked in the division that was all about vendor assessments, right? Risk assessment is a similar mechanism for that. And so you have pieces of data that get more sensitive as the relationship goes on. And the more those are verified by your network, I'm guessing the stronger that network becomes. In my TradeShift days, one of our main customers was the British healthcare system. So all of their suppliers, right, very similar to what you're discussing now. So have very firsthand knowledge on this. And the idea of the network reinforcing that. And even within one organization, you may use vendors. One chain of a large scale healthcare system may have to reassess those vendors multiple times as they go into different hospitals or different practices or however that structure.
Well, based on tiers or priority, based on the fact that it's a critical function. And if it goes down, there are no alternatives because contractually you've signed exclusivity clauses with the vendor. So that was the Change Health issue, right? They funneled all clearinghouse functions through one pipe. And when that went down, all bets are off to that industry.
Let's talk about the vendor themselves, because that is usually the most exposed risk that you have and why third-party risk management is so important. And it's more than just contractual risk transfer because there's all sorts of things that can happen within that structure. So let's talk about what technologies and what things are happening on a daily basis and how much risk are you actually opening yourself up to with how you select vendors and all of that. What are some of the actual real stats?
Yeah. So if you look at any of the stats that are public through the OCR, you'll see that more than half of the data breaches come from a third party. And that continues to increase, right? So it used to be that the source of the breach was an internal system, but now everything is moved to the cloud, right? And every function within an organization is on an application. It's being run, technology is basically running the business process. So you've got to be a steward not only of the data, but you have to be a steward of the network. And so it's more than just technology. It's also the people that you're letting in to the hospital that have access to your network as well. So it's a multifaceted, it's very complicated. And it really starts with asking the business, okay, what are your most critical vendors and products? If these went down, which ones would disrupt our business? Which one would stop our ability to generate revenue? Which, sign up customers, service customers, right? So it's really doing that level of assessment and then tiering those into buckets of artificial high, medium, low, critical high, medium, low, whatever, and then spending and applying the right resources to make sure you're covering the critical and the high ones first, right? But you have to cover all of them, unfortunately. And the only way to do that is through automation. You need a platform because it's not just that first assessment, it's the subsequent assessments. You mentioned a reassessment, right? Setting up reassessments based on tiers is really important, but the scope of risk changes over time. And so it's not just out of the box risk that's there with the vendor and the product, but it's over time. Does the usage change? Does the scope of usage change? We were using it in this one department. Now we're using it across the enterprise. Does the data that we were managing change? We were using non-PHI data, protected health information. Now we're using PHI information. So that requires a BAA. So it's that managing the life cycle of risk across the relationship with that vendor, cradle to grave and all points in between. Have we implemented it in a way that we've implemented controls to mitigate or remediate some of the risks on our end as well? Those are really important things, and those can change over time. I'll give you a good example. I heard about this example recently. The health system was going to buy an ultrasound. They'd purchased an ultrasound from this vendor. So it was the same provider. It was the same model of ultrasound. And they figured, oh, we've got them here. We don't need to assess them, right? After installation, they ran an IVA scan, internal vulnerability assessment scan on it. And they found that things were running Windows XP 6 years past the end of life of Windows XP. So,
Yeah, right.
So these things happen all the time.
You have some 12-year-old doing some 10-year-old exploit, right? And getting into these machines. Yeah, terrible.
Yeah, exactly. Or we brought in people to do a quality assessment of our organization. It's consultants. So we didn't think we had to assess anything. It's not technology. But the consultants come on board. They deploy on desktops listeners so that they can actually measure quality, and they're sending that data up into the cloud, and no one's done an assessment.
Yeah, right.
Right. So these things are happening all the time. And that's why it requires you to take a holistic view of your supply chain and all the different vendors and products that are being used in the organization. And the only way to do that is through an automated system.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because the number one complaint that I get time and time again when I talk to risk managers is in our industry, whatever industry they're part of, 15 years ago, the amount of information, the amount of risk that I had to manage and actually understand, and I could understand, was this. So if I come from construction, I understand the risk related to construction-based projects, and that's already a huge amount of information. But now we're asking risk managers with almost little budget, right, to handle risks that are well beyond their industry expertise and well into cyber and into things like active shooter and all these crazy security risks and everything that everyone has to deal with. At the same time, the only way that we're going to be able to assess all those risks and actually empower risk management at the scale it needs to be is with AI. Yet that's the fundamental risk that will also be used to exploit you. How does a risk manager balance that? How today, and that at this point, I think it's a little bit more than a philosophical question, but at the philosophical level, how do you deal with, there's so many risks that there's no way one person is actually going to be able to wrap their hands around it. Yet the thing that will allow us to wrap our hands around it is very much the thing that could really sink the ship. I guess the heart of the question are AI optimist, anti-AI, and then how do you position it so that you can take advantage of the advantages and not suffer the penalties?
Okay. So I'm a technology optimist always, first and foremost, because that's what I was born from, right? I've been a technologist when I was a small kid as well. So for me, it's if you just pull the sacred trinity, people, process, and technology, and start there, right? You start with the people. Do we have the right people in place? Do we understand the use cases around AI before we bring it in? Do we understand the impact of AI if there are risks associated? Do we understand what the risk could be? Do we have a cross-functional team, a committee around governance? Because this is new and it's coming fast and furious. And in healthcare, it's very different in terms of who has the power to make decisions, right? In healthcare, there's a bit of a pecking order. Surgeons, doctors, God, nurses, right? So surgeons and doctors have a lot of power. And again, I tongue in cheek, but they can buy things that they see as game changers to patient safety, patient care, and patient outcomes, right? And of course, they care about safety, but they also care about care delivery and the impact that these technologies can have on that. And so you've got to get them involved in that process. So you've got to figure out who the stakeholders are, first and foremost, as a risk manager, and get them in the process, number one. Also remember that risk is business risk. It's not technology risk. Even cyber is part of that, but if you can't communicate the risk in the language that the business speaks, you're never going to drive true change in the environment. And in order to get an AI adopted in a safe way, you have to be an agent of change. You have to be willing to transform the way the organization thinks about technology adoption. Because guess what? It's happening, whether you know it or not. So I'll give you a great example that happened to me today. I opened up Notepad. I'm embarrassed to say I use Microsoft Notepad. I don't use OneNote. I've been using Notepad for years. They just added AI to that. By
Yep.
default, they turned it on. Shame on them,
Yep.
right? Now, think about that in the context of healthcare. They have products and technologies they've been working on. Those products and technologies are turning on AI, some through notification, but most aren't notifying the hospital or the health system. So they've got to deal with that vector of potential risk and attack. Then you've got the adoption of new technology that's coming in through the purchase of systems and solutions and et cetera, we talked about earlier. That's another vector that they've got to figure out how to assess and manage. And then you have patches or new features that come in through existing technology that you accept and that you didn't realize now have activated AI. You knew about the patch, but you didn't realize part of that was AI, right?
Yeah. The feature set wasn't explained. The
The
risk
feature set wasn't explained, right?
It is surprising to me that enterprise software doesn't provide more upfront about the risk of the additional things or how they're securing that, like any other vendor would have to. If you switched out your server maintenance person for your in-house server, you would have to tell someone, hey, we're switching this person out because they would have gone through vets and everything else. And yet software kind of doesn't follow the same thing. As being a software person in Silicon Valley, I understand why it's our job to disrupt things. But at the same time, we are now disrupting things that will impact safety in a way that we should be way more aware of. The role of technology being as commonplace now as a filing cabinet with a lock on it, technologists should take that more seriously, I think.
Yeah. And this is where regulation and agencies like the FDA that regulate medical devices, right? So you want to ensure that the medical device that you're connected to is not just getting a random AI update while you're connected to the device, right? So there's so those regulations are actually good. There's some other challenges with the FDA, but it's hard to do that broadly, right? That's a hard regulation for every industry to swallow, especially consumers, right? Consumers aren't they're just gonna, like we see it all the time. You get this incredible license, you page through it and you accept it because you just want to use the application. Real life, you've just sold your soul to Apple or to Facebook, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I also am super interested. You're the first guest that I've had that has a fellow podcast in risk, and you talk about risk, right? Risk never
Yeah.
sleeps. Can we just talk a little bit about that podcast and sort of what you cover in it for the audience?
Yeah, you bet. I love learning about the people behind the roles. The reason I love healthcare so much is the relationships are very different. There's a shared mission in healthcare that is unlike any other industry. And you really get to know people at a deep level that just didn't exist if you're dealing with a bank, oil producer, or whatever. And so with that, I thought there's a lot of podcasts out there. Most of them are technically oriented in nature, like this one, right? although you asked some questions about me personally, which is nice, there was nothing that really focused on the person. And for me, I take a page out of the Howard Stern / Joe Rogan playbook, right? You get to really learn about the things about people that oftentimes people don't have the opportunity to share. It was a thesis. I started out doing it. I got a lot of really good positive feedback early on. And I think, I don't know, it's 2.5 years into it. We have probably 140 some odd episodes.
I've listened to quite a few of them. So,
oh, well, thank you, Jason. You're the guy.
I'm the guy. No, yeah. One of the things that I found fascinating when I came in as CRO of TrustLayer is there's all these conferences. And when you come to a risk management conference, the amount of information that people are sharing about how they protect their organizations is amazing. But when they leave that conference, they go back to their office and they shut their door and they manage their fiefdom, right? And there's not a lot of communication. And it became very clear to me that these people had a lot of information to share, but were not being asked to share because they're not the CEO of some company that's just got funded. And so I really, as a product manager, felt very much like talking to these people and talking about the intersection of technology in my industry, which is insurance and risk transfer, which is where we spend our time. That industry is moving very quickly and adopting. The entire insurance industry is about to be in a place where the actuary model doesn't make any sense for how they price things or anything else that's happening, right? So very much in a state of change. And I think having these conversations and having risk managers be able to listen to these conversations and not people always having the solution and trying to sell their solution, but instead have real informed conversations about the gray area of what we do, I think is an incredibly important mission statement for people and is why I feel like the industry is so engaging for me personally. Any awesome stories or practical frameworks from the show or from your interviews that spring to mind?
Well, as you would expect, people are complex and interesting once you get an opportunity to dig in there. And everyone's dealing with something. Everyone's sort of dealing with some issue or some challenge. I think that from the interviews I've had, the question that always surprises me when I ask, if you go back in time and talk to your 20-year-old self and give them advice, what would you say to them? What would you say to your 20-year-old self? And I'm always interested in the responses because there's a group of responses that go something like this, buy Microsoft.
Right.
Then there's other responses that, again, it's not a degree of thoughtfulness or not, but it's like, don't sweat the small things. Don't be so hard on yourself. It's all going to work out. Enjoy the journey. Like, don't worry about over planning. Like, just let it happen to some extent. Don't stress out too much about things. And I love that. I love that advice.
Yep. The number one piece of advice that people give on this podcast that always resonates with me is the work of a risk manager requires curiosity, right? It requires to pick up the stone that other people would just walk past, to check the device that just came in, even though it's the same device you've gotten 100 other times, and actually run the diagnostic on it to understand it. It takes that eagerness to find the leaky hole on the boat. Like, yeah, maybe it's not going to sink it, but it's there. And if you get enough of them, then it's an operable system, right? And I find that to be so interesting. I'm so glad that we're on this journey together. And I'm so glad that you're bringing risk assessments and your tool is helping the healthcare industry use predictive analytics and all of these things. So I suggest anyone who's in that space to look at your solution and listen to your podcast. I think it's very informative. I'm going to move on to risky or too risky. Are you ready for that, Ed? Are you good?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. Relying on outdated technology for critical business operations, risky or too risky?
Outdated, too risky.
Too risky. Okay. Well, that one was an easy one. Adopting a new corporate governance structure without piloting it within a department first.
So it's just risky or too risky? Those are my options?
Risky or too risky, yeah.
I don't think it's either. I guess I would say risky.
Okay, good. The reason I ask that is because a lot of people try to manage risk at the governance level and create policies and then try to enforce those policies and spend all their time managing those policies from the top down. It makes me believe that you're saying that the policies need to manage from the ground up, from the base layer all the way up to the corporate level. Am I right in that assumption? Is that how you suggest people manage governance, or how do you suggest people manage governance?
I think it's a little of both, quite frankly, because I think we're at an interesting precipice in the whole industry around risk management, right? So for years, risk management was largely a documentation process, right? After the fact, we captured these things and then we tried to build risk models so that they can inform future decisions based on what we saw, right? And along comes technology. And one of the things that we saw was this opportunity to combine risk with operations. We call it risk ops, sort of like DevOps came into play and SecOps, right? And so I think tomorrow's risk managers need to be more curious, more, quite frankly, like QA people than traditional risk people. They also need to be influencers. Like they have to be able to work across businesses and influence, not have control. Very different, right? Most risk people I talk to want control. They want to say no. But in fact, it's a business decision. It's like your job is to present the data, let the business make the risk decision. And I think sometimes that gets lost. So influence is really critical as well. And to some extent, have those political chops to transcend the role to be much more of a consultant, if you will, to the organization. And we're at this point where this is the age of risk management, right? We're at the age of risk management. This is like being a cloud architect 10, 15 years ago at RSA, realizing, oh my God, every single panel is about cloud architecture, right? And with AI, it's all about risk. It's all about what do we do from a risk perspective that's largely led through governance, to your question.
I completely agree with you. And my first real foray into my career was working at Rackspace on something called the redundant server cluster. My customer was Salesforce. And my second phase of my career was starting a operational practice that built operations like a product. And I created the term revenue operations. And by creating revenue operations, I showed that the place that we're moving to is generalist orchestration from a people perspective and systems being highly specific. And I'm in risk now because I believe that the next wave of operational excellence is going to happen in risk. So you and I believe a very similar story. And it feels like we're doing this for very similar reasons. Is when my friends say, why are you a technologist now at an insurtech company? I answer the question with, this is where I think the next place where the metal, whatever that saying is, where the metal hits the floor, right? Where I think things really change. Personal risky or not too risky for you. Bypassing a security checkpoint at an event to save time, risky or too risky?
I've done that. I did that during 9/11 to get on a plane. It's either. I have such a high risk tolerance, Jason. I've been a student of risk since I think I was 6 years old.
Yeah. Well, you do go to those Grateful Dead concerts.
I'm going to the Sphere in May for 6
Amazing.
shows.
That's going to be awesome. Big fan of you, Ed. I appreciate you being on the podcast, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you, man.
All right, see you.
Risk Management Brick by Brick is brought to you by TrustLayer. Find out how TrustLayer manages risk so that the people can build the physical world around us. Head over to trustlayer.io. And then make sure to subscribe to Risk Management Brick by Brick on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. On behalf of the TrustLayer team, thank you for listening.